All right, friends, welcome back to another edition of the Forza Athletics Life and Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Inferna. Today, I'm really excited. We have a really special guest, Liz Brookhouse from Delta Mentality. She's a mental performance coach where we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about mental conditioning, mindset, preparation for athletics, especially with this kind of like crazy time that we're in right now. Liz, thank you so much for coming on our podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is great.
So, thank you. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about, growing up as a kid, like how you got involved with sports, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a small farm town in Michigan. And, at my high school, if you didn't play every sport, then we didn't have enough kids to field a team. So I was super fortunate to be able to try a bunch of different sports. I grew up playing basketball, volleyball, softball, and I ran track for a couple years there. I was pretty terrible at softball and track, but I was fortunate to be able to excel at volleyball and basketball a little bit. And so those were my primary sports. Through high school, I had some interest in going on to play in college, but I really wanted a bigger college experience because I was from such a small high school.
Sure.
And unfortunately, I wasn't good enough to play at a big D1 like I wanted to attend for college. So I ended up going to Michigan State, didn't play any sports there. Got a bachelor's degree in exercise physiology. When I was there, I thought I wanted to do like cardiac rehab or strength and conditioning or something like that. But my senior year, I took an internship I took a class in sports psychology and was able to do an internship working with some youth sports in an after-school sports program, and absolutely fell in love with it. I knew the role that sports played in my life, and I thought it was a really great, snapshot into the impact that I could have in the lives of other kids. And so that's kind of how I got interested in sports psych, and then went on to get my master's degree in sport and performance psychology, and the balls just kind of kept rolling from there.
Now, Michigan State, like for the research that I do in regards to coach-athlete relationships and elite coaching, Michigan State's like a hotbed for that. I feel like in every peer-reviewed article that I submit, there's like 15 or 20 citations from somebody from Michigan State who has obviously come before and done all this. So, talk a little bit about like did when you were in college at Michigan State, was there like how prevalent is like mental conditioning or sports psychology at a bigger, because I went to a tiny D3 school, right? 5,000 students. We had one psychology professor who is on the sports psychology. I don't know what the acronym is, but he is like listed as like a sports psychologist, like for having this level of licensure.
Sure.
But we never, like, we didn't know like what it was, and this is 2000 through 2004, so not like in the 80s or 90s or something. But so did you ever like work with any of the athletes on campus, or just more at like kind of like the youth level?
Yeah, so at Michigan State, because it is such a big institution, they have a lot of folks that are much more experienced, much more qualified, especially than I was in undergrad. So they had their own department, and at the time, I didn't realize how extensive it was. You spoke a little bit about some of the research that comes out of there. The Institute for the Study of Youth Sports is huge there. That's where I was able to do my internship. And so I worked with Dr. Gould and Dr. Lauer and Dr. Ewing, who are some of the, best, I think, to do youth sport development. So I was much more hands-on with the youth development after schools, building life skills through sport. And so I did that for about a year. I didn't really work with athletes in the capacity similar to what I do now until I was in grad school at Miami of Ohio. Yeah.
Okay. So talk a little bit about how because you have your own Delta Mentality, so your own performance business. Yeah. How do you fall into that? Like after you graduate with your master's degree, is there like some prep of, okay, you take a couple of college courses in business administration and like this is how it works? Or can you talk a little bit about like how you made that transition post grad school?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I actually started working for the United States Army right after I got done with my master's degree. And so I was doing applied performance work for them for a couple years. And my full-time job is still with them, but much more of like a strategic curriculum development. How do we, get this type of training institutionalized throughout a soldier's career life cycle. So I still work with them, in a full-time capacity, a little bit different now. And so I really wanted to get back to working with athletics and being able to help coach people through their own development process and journey. And so, I kind of made the jump, I think it's been a year and a half ago now, where I started really just reaching out to some volleyball coaches. That's my sport. That's what my fiance coaches. And so I've been really fortunate to have some coaching connections that way, and just said, hey, do you mind if I come in and talk to your team about confidence or about mindset and how that, plays a role in your sport? And it started really small, and I've just been trying to, network and make connections. But, you asked, do you take classes in business administration?
Right.
Dang it. I wish I would have, because I feel like, that's something I share with a lot of folks that are interested in getting into mental performance and mental training and having their own business. It's not enough just to know psychology. It's not enough just to know coaching science. You have to know business. You have to know networking and communication and how to develop a well-rounded, curriculum that's going to make an impact. And so it's been a learning curve, but I'm working on it.
Well, the reason why I ask is my brother-in-law just graduated a couple of years ago. He has his doctorate in physical therapy. And as he was going through the program, I was like, do you guys take classes on like business, like accounting, like if you're going to open up your own, performance center? And his program doesn't. And it's I think it's a little bit more prominent in New York that they turn out really, really good physical therapists. And I just find that interesting that with that you wouldn't have, or that a program wouldn't say, okay, here's an accounting class, just manage your books or something. But I don't want to digress too much from, what we're going to talk about. So in your work with volleyball and maybe like individual athletes, like, do you notice differences when it comes to mental performance or preparation? In volleyball, you have 6 people on the court at a time, right? So you do kind of have to rely on others, depending on if you're looking at for your own performance, as opposed to like a team mindset. Where I coach throwers, and we're part of a team of track and field, but when my kids go into the circle, there's really not much more I can do, right? Like I can't yell at them when they're ready to release the shot, or on their finish in the discus. So can you talk a little bit about like what just you see as like broad scope of differences in working with team sports as opposed to more individual, like track or weightlifting or swimming, stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely some differences, and it's something that I've had to kind of learn over time. If you come in and talk to a group about, for example, like communication, obviously it's still really important in a sport like track and field. But, I was working with a swim team who said, Liz, we don't really care if we get along, because if I swim well, that's all that really matters. Like I'm doing my part, for the team. So it definitely is, there are differences, and it's interesting. I think, in my experience working with a team sport versus an individual sport, something that comes up a lot is just the absolute grind that training is for an individual sport. You are a lot of the times training all by yourself, or, everybody's on their own trajectory. And so it's, how do I stay engaged and involved when I'm not necessarily, getting to play or perform in the way that some team sports might be able to. So that's a really big thing that comes up. I was working with a group of throwers here in central Pennsylvania, and they said, it's crazy. You train all year for maybe, like 4 or 5 performances, and it's really hard to stay engaged and, really committed to the process, when some weeks it's like, man, I could think of 1,000 other things that I'd rather do than go lift, even though it's going to help. Right. But staying engaged has been a struggle for a lot of the individual athletes that I work with.
I find that all the time, even working with college kids at the D3 level, that, our kids, or mine mostly, they come to school, they're going to be, physical therapists or nurses or teachers and things like that. So they're involved because they love it. So there's like a positive side there, but then in the past, like we kind of talked about offline, it seems like social media with the boom of, not so much mental performance, but higher level athletes talking about their anxieties and like the pressures that they feel.
Sure.
How would you like work with athletes? Maybe you could give a couple examples of, maybe some like higher tier, like elite level athletes, and even like middle school kids, like, cause they feel pressure like to perform in things. Like how do you go about like trying to manage those things? I know it's a really loaded question, right? For like 10 minutes, but with I don't know, have you noticed a difference or like an increase over the last few years of more athletes coming out and wanting to talk to somebody that does mental performance? I guess we could start there and kind of move forward.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think definitely from, you see folks like Michael Phelps and some other athletes that have come out and said, I've struggled, with mental health. I think that's gotten us talking a lot more about mental health and mental performance, but I think that there's an important distinction that we have to make between, at least from my standpoint. I'm not credentialed to do clinical work. And I think, that's a big theoretical discussion that a lot of athletic departments have for really great reasons.
Right.
But they're different services. Right. And so I think, folks coming out and talking about mental health and those things, really great, because it's got us talking about what it means to even consider mental health or mental wellness or mental performance and the role that it has in our lives. I see my role as almost like a gatekeeper between the athletes, the department, and whatever other resources they may need, whether that's mental health or academic support services, just getting them in the right direction. I see a lot of folks come to me as a kind of first line of defense of like, hey, I don't know if I need to go talk to a therapist, or if maybe academic, services might be the best route for me, or maybe I just need to like talk it out one time with you and then I'm done. Or maybe it's even more of like a performance enhancement type of, relationship where we're working on skills to continue to improve their performance. So definitely, I think there's been an openness and a willingness to come and chat. I think a lot of folks don't really understand, what it is we do. And so I think that's definitely the first step in the right direction.
So like at our campus, I think there's 5 individuals in our like health center that are licensed to do that work, I guess, in New York. So at like undergrad campus, like at NAS, we have like 3,000 kids.
Right.
We're at the University of Rochester, where I do a lot of my research. We have like 50,000-60,000 students. So it's really overwhelming. What are some like common, like if someone's going to reach out to you, like what are common themes or issues that are going on that you're seeing right now in regards to, mental performance coaching?
Yeah, sure. So I would say a few things come, if I'm thinking about all the things that I've seen in the last year or so, these few things come up. Confidence is probably the number one, whether that's lack of confidence, or I've just never had it, or I had it and I can't maintain it after a mistake. I spend a lot of time talking about confidence and what that means. I spend a lot of time talking about time management, which is something that doesn't directly fall into, mental performance, but it's definitely something that is obviously really important and prevalent, especially with college athletes. How do I manage all these demands and make sure that I'm doing, juggling all the balls that I have to juggle as a student athlete the best that I can. And then another thing that comes up related to time management, I think, but we have a bigger issue with it than just time management, I think, is just like social media and the pressure that comes from that, which you mentioned earlier. It's just, especially when you're working with Division I athletes that are a little bit more high profile, and on ESPN and some things like that, there are a lot of, armchair quarterbacks out there that are telling you how you should be doing your job. So that's something that, not as much where I am now, but in the past has come up quite a bit. Like, how do I manage that and, really stay focused on how I can do my best, not let everything else kind of get in the way.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that about the confidence in social media, because when I was a college athlete at Fredonia, there was this website. Anybody who knows track is going to chuckle about this. So it was called Raceberry Jam was the website. And, you would have a college meet on a Saturday, and then you had to wait like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to see like where your performance stacked up against the rest of the country, depending on what level you competed at. And back then in 2000 to 2004, they had an A standard. So if you threw this far, you knew you were automatically going to nationals. And then if you hit the B standard, they would take you if there weren't enough athletes to populate the A. So usually it was like 20 hammer throwers or shot putters or whatever. And you had to wait and wait and wait and wait. And it's like, oh my gosh, like the next meet's coming up, like coaches haven't submitted their performances, or some coaches would hang on till the very end. And it just got like, kind of like, now if one of my athletes throws, it's on Twitter, like in 10 seconds, like they throw, boom, they post it. And it seems like that there's always like this competition, you know, with somebody across the country, like somebody you've never met before, but oh my gosh, like if I don't throw far and I don't post it. And I just find that really interesting. And for me, who has zero experience in any of this mental performance coaching stuff, what advice, like how do coaches and I don't, maybe it might be different at the D3 level as opposed to like the D1 where you have your higher profile, you know, your Heisman, you know, trophy quarterbacks, and then, you know, somebody who's at D3 who, you know, that's all they'll do. How do you like manage those things? Like, is it more of, you know, I just got, you know, if I see those 3 dots and I send a text message, like I'm waiting, like, oh my gosh, like, are they responding? Like, are they responding? Like, are they going to respond? Like, if somebody came to you with that, like, how do you kind of talk them? I want to say off the ledge a little bit, but you know, how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one, and this question I ask to a lot of athletes for a lot of different purposes, but I think it's really helpful here is, you know, I always ask my athletes, like, is this helping you? And if it's not serving you, if it's not helping you, then like, let's get rid of that strategy that's not working. Some athletes find a lot of motivation behind, you know, social comparison. And I think as long as you don't put all your eggs in that basket, I think that's totally fine. If that's what motivates you, especially in a sport like, you know, track and field or throwing, where maybe your best competition in order to motivate you to that next level isn't, you know, on your own team. That's something that could be a very real reality for you. But I think, you know, the problem becomes when, you know, you finish a you know, meet or a game or a match or whatever it is, and you pull out your phone really quick to see what everybody else is thinking. It's like, well, at that point, it's not helping you. And so I think a big thing that you have to do is ask that question, like, is this helping me? Is it hurting me? And then if it's harming you, let's get rid of it and try to refocus on what's the most important thing for me to continue to get better. Because at the end of the day, like, you know, if you're comparing your distances to everybody else, it's like, it doesn't matter if you're not actually getting better. You're never going to beat them if you're not focused on what you can control. So that's a question that I, you know, tend to ask my athletes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I first started coaching, nobody had cell phones, right? I was a grad student in 04, 05. So, I mean, people had cell phones, but, you know, the iPhone hadn't come out yet. And that's a whole nother thing when I was teaching, like the total disruption it caused in high schools.
Gosh, it's terrible.
But like up until that point, like there wasn't that. Like Facebook just came out. So there wasn't. So do you see any, I know you just said, you know, if it's not helpful, don't use it. But do you see any like positives to that? Like, is there, like, what's the silver lining with like the social comparison, even though, you know, people are thousands of miles apart?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you bring that up, because I think a lot of the times we hear this, like, just the negative associations with social media in this generation. And I mean, I don't know how we're chopping up generations this year, but, you know, I tend to fall with the younger generation, and I think I can really vouch for and empathize with folks that find a lot of meaning in social media and the connections that you can make with other folks. You know, I participate recreationally in triathlon, and there aren't a ton of people in central Pennsylvania that do it. And so being able to post about it on social media and reach out and share those, you know, training wins with other folks is really helpful for me. It gives me a sense of community. Now, sometimes I find myself obviously like, oh, well, this person ran a 5K in this time, like I need to pick it up. But there are so many people that, you know, really support you, and it helps build that sense of community. And if you have the right people in your social network, it can be really powerful. They, you know, tons of people support me, and I know I see that everywhere else as well, as long as you know, keep a close eye on your social media accounts. Right.
Well, I just started, I've tried dabbling in the last couple of years in triathlon, just as like a change from like more strength sports.
Yeah.
And I agree that they're like, even when I first started, like I didn't really, like I weighed 270 pounds when I did my first sprint race, and it took me over 2 hours. And I was like, yeah, you know, I finished last, like for my age group. And then I was like, oh, well, there's like weight classes with age groups too. So like last summer, I was like, oh, maybe I can compete well against like people my own age that weigh the same. And that was like, then I started feeling like my adrenaline started picking up again, like always like being in competition. But I think with the social media piece, like I was reaching out to triathletes who are more, you know, higher profile. And I'm like, listen, like I've never done this before. I'm a huge guy, you know, I'm 6'1", like I can't find like a wetsuit, like help me
Right.
out.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that in that community, like I could talk to somebody who's an age group national champion or somebody who's competed at the Olympic trials, and they'll send the DM back immediately on Instagram. And I'm like, wow, like, and I'm always very thankful and appreciative of that. And I think for some of those communities, like throwing as well, I always encourage the high school kids that I train with or that I coach, you know, send somebody a DM on Instagram. Like the worst that, you know, I guess the worst that happens is they look at it and you see the scene on the bottom and then they
Right.
don't respond, which could cause a whole nother set of, you know, anxiety. But more often than not, people are very responsive and receptive to that. And I agree that in certain communities, you can reach out to somebody who's, you know, a national champion Olympic weightlifter. And I've done that too. Like, hey, you know, I have this podcast. You want to, you know, you want to come on and I think people would be surprised as the outreach, like how accommodating people might be with this. But
yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think people are willing to help. You just have to, you know, reach out and ask them for it. Yeah.
So when you talk about like the focus, like I think that's something that I've had the most difficulty with, and I think maybe college, even like across the board, like if you're gonna come in and like work on it like in a seminar, like if coaches reach out to you for like bigger teams and they say, you know, Liz, we need help in this area. You kind of talked about it more as like on an individual with like confidence and like the social media thing.
Yeah.
Is it similar conversations with like bigger teams? Like if you're going to work with volleyball, or I mean the Army, right? Like
Yeah.
what type of conversations would you have like at the Army? I mean, like, you know, physically, like they have to be at the top, right? Mentally, you would think like, wow, like these people are gonna, you know, they're serving our country, and I'm very grateful for them to do that service. But what are those like conversations like when you might get a call from I don't know how it works in the Army, like a general or a colonel, and
Yeah.
someone's gonna say, hey Liz, you know, we got a, you know, a team here or a group that we'd like you to talk to. Like what do you talk to an Army, you know, like a soldier about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny you pose it like that because it
Right,
is like that a lot of times. Like if
right,
somebody, you know, a company commander, whoever will
right.
call and like, hey, I'd love for you to come in and talk to my guys. And it's like, okay, about what? And they're like, I don't know, they're just messed up. It's like, all right. That's not much direction, but it's fine. So
Sure.
a lot of the times, one thing, especially in a situation like that, where, you know, somebody might call me and be like, I really think the mental side of whatever I do is important, you know, military or otherwise.
Mhm,
One of the first things, you know, I do, and I'm fortunate, you know, in sports, I've been around sports my whole life,
mhm,
so I understand a lot of them pretty closely.
mhm,
But the first step, I think, is being able to really understand the context in which folks have to operate
mhm.
and know the specific demands that that group is facing.
Sure.
And just because I know what the track and field team at Bucknell is dealing with doesn't mean that I know what the track and field team at any other, you know, university or college is dealing with. So that's one of the first things I like to do is just to come
Mhm,
in and say, either with the coaching staff or just observe a practice or whatever it is,
mhm,
just to get a little bit better grasp on what exactly is kind of going on and what are some
mhm,
of the most, you know, prevalent things that I might be able to start with.
mhm,
You know, after that, it just really depends. You know, a lot of the conversations that I have one-on-one with athletes, I end up replicating in a bigger setting with a group. It more closely mimics, I think, you know, kind of the battle rhythm that I follow is I'll just introduce a topic, get folks talking about, you know, what they think about that topic or how it impacts their performance. I'll teach a couple of strategies and then do some type of applied, you know, exercise or getting them thinking about how can I directly apply this to my performance. And then I'll let them go. I'll let them try it out in practice or during, you know, battle drills if we're working with the
sure.
military,
Sure.
just to see how does that actually make an impact. And it, you know, I always say this to coaches. I think I approach my work much like coaches do in that,
Mhm,
hey, we're going to try a small tweak, see how it works,
mhm.
and we'll go from there.
So do people think that, you know, sometimes like if it's an individual or a team that they'll talk to you for a half hour or an hour and then like oh, I'm like, like the light switch goes
Yeah.
off? Or is it more of a, because like, you know, with throwing, and I don't want to just keep going back to that, but I guess that's kind
Sure.
of like what I know.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can teach somebody how to throw a discus in like 30 minutes, right? Like it might not look beautiful, but I
Sure.
could get them to stay in the circle and land in a sector, and it's going to be a fair throw. So that's the kind of like the easier part, or maybe it's more simple. When working like the mental side of any type of athletic performance, like do you have to train the mind just as much as you do
Yeah.
physically, right? Like it's not just something where, okay, today I'm going to focus like really hard.
Yep.
Like it's not just as easy as, okay, I'm going to leave my phone. Maybe it is as easy. I'm just going to leave my phone at home for this hour, or I'm not going to check anything. Um, Talk a little bit about like what like might be some misconceptions in regards to, you know, I'm good for an hour, or, you know, it takes a little bit of like it takes a year or 2 or 3 to kind of like start figuring out, oh, wow, like if I can focus on this for 2 hours, my performance is going to be better than if I get distracted every 10 minutes by a text message or, you know, a Snapchat or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you hit the nail right on the head, Charles. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions is that a few things. The
Sure.
first one, before we even get to that point, is that mental performance is just for people that are screwed up or that are really
Right.
struggling. And that's not
Right.
true. We know some of the most elite athletes use it as an integral part of their
Mhm.
training. And so that's the first thing that I try to dispel is mental performance isn't another, thing that we have to do.
Right.
It's already interwoven in our performance. And so we're just more deliberately training that side
Mhm.
of the game. So I think that's the first big one. The other big one is that, we're going to, Liz will come in and talk to us for an hour about focus and attention, and all of a sudden we'll never have any, focus or attention issues.
Right.
Typically what I see though is that after I come in, and maybe do an hour or 45-minute session, folks do really well with that particular,
Mhm.
topic for the next week or so. And then things start to kind of decline again. And it's because it's not at the forefront of their mind. And
Sure.
the important thing to remember about mental training is that we're actually changing the way that we operate, right? And that takes time, whether that's readjusting our values or our overall mindset, or actually working on some of those, mental connections with neuroplasticity and some of those other things. That stuff takes time. Like I wouldn't expect you to be able to just come in and do, some crazy Olympic lift
Right.
when you didn't know it, 2 seconds ago. So really building that repetition and consistency with mental training is probably the number one most important thing. And that's what I find myself working with teams a lot on is I'll come in and do a 1 hour session, but I need you to promise me that I can come back maybe, 10 days from now, and just, even if it's a short reminder of, hey, remember last time we were in here, we talked about the importance of being all in during training. Let's make sure we put those phones away. And I want you to pay attention to anytime you have a distracting thought about, hey, I need to get back to homework, or I wonder what my boyfriend or girlfriend's doing, or, anything like that. Those small repetitions and reinforcements
Mhm.
are, the most important pieces with mental training.
Yeah, you know, the class thing is interesting because the last couple of years I've coached kids that were in like a very competitive nursing program or physical therapy program and things. And if I can get them for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, like I thought that was an accomplishment for me, even though we would practice for like an hour and a half, because I know, like, I didn't go to college to be a teacher. Like I was going to throw at the 2004 Olympic trials. Like I didn't do as well as I should have in undergrad. And I was told that many times by Fredonia. Um, anyway, like fortunately my parents, I intercepted those letters before they
Yeah.
did, but like I went to throw. So for me, like if I went to class twice a week for anything, like I thought that was a win. Like I wanted to, so the coaches, I was all in, like, Trevor Hitchcock, my throwing coach, like he didn't have to worry about me. Like
Yeah.
I was going to throw and throw and throw. But for coaches today, where I don't know if it's just different. I mean, it's been 20 years. Like it feels weird for me to say that. Like I just
Yeah.
turned 38. Like, well, like 20 years ago, I was a freshman in college, and that's all I wanted to do. Do you think like coaches, like, is there something that we can do to better work with athletes who are of this like I'm older than you, so like of this, we're probably like different generation, right?
Yeah.
Like it's social media is all around us. So what, like, how can we better be prepared to work with our athletes who might have all of these distractions going on all the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest thing that coaches can do, and this is something that, I find myself saying a lot, is that it's really easy, and I'm even guilty of it with my younger brother. I have a 16-year-old younger brother, and I find myself doing it even, saying, oh, he's, that age of kids is just, they're just tough to work with. But I think the biggest thing is being a little bit more empathetic and understanding that, we thought, I'm sure you can relate to this. We thought of our parents as completely different and weird in a lot of ways. And so being able to just understand, like, this is just it's a different time, and really finding what's most important to the athletes. You mentioned social media. That's a big thing. And so a lot of the coaches that I work with, it's been about, like, if social media is important to them, how do we engage in a productive way using those things that are important? If having, experiences is important, then how do we create experiences that are meaningful that also help us move, in the right direction in terms of our training or our sport? And so, being able to find those things that are most important to your athletes, you have to know who you're working with, and be able to leverage and manipulate a little bit, that point to your advantage.
Yeah, so I never did the Snapchat thing up until a couple years ago, and then I realized that that's all the kids responded to.
Right.
I call them kids, they're 18 and 19 and the young adults, right? But like, it was difficult to get an email back or even a group text. So they're like, oh, coaches, download Snapchat. And I'm like, but it's the same as a text message. They're like, no, we have our notifications on. We want to look at that. And my wife's like, what, like, why are you doing that? And I'm like, well, if this is how I could get to the kids, like, okay, practice is going to be moved a little bit, or, this is when the bus leaves, because we would have kids that never read their emails, like didn't have a clue on that stuff. But if they got a Snap or Instagram or Twitter, not so much Twitter, but that's what worked. And some of the older coaches that work with throwers, that social media stuff, like, this is how, we didn't have that in the 80s and things. And you see a lot of, like, higher profile Division I basketball coaches, like, we have to adapt to our kids. Like, it's not the other way around, where like, this generation of coaches speaks like that. But then if you ever listen to, like, Lou Holtz, give a talk from Notre Dame, we bring you here to be us. We don't become you. So it's like, wow, like, these two, like, Hall of Fame coaches have two totally different mindsets on it, but they were still able to accomplish whatever their goals were. And I just wonder if there are coaches that reach out that it's more for them, like, how do I spend my time getting better with the kids? Like, do you see a reluctancy sometimes from, like, I wish I had somebody like you, like we were talking, like, when I was 20 or 21, like, I think athletically I might have had a much better career. But as a coach, I would reach out too, like, hey, listen, like, Liz, I'm really having difficulty with this. Are you noticing more of an influx of, like, coaches reaching out just for support for themselves? Not so much come talk to our kids, but talk to me.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, for me personally, I have only worked with a handful of coaches, and I think it's not because I don't think it's important. In fact, that's where I think we have a huge missed market in terms of sport and performance psychology, is, coaches and athletic departments in general. But yeah, I spend, I would say, 90 to 95% of my time working with athletes, and I think it is a little bit of a reluctance, or this perception that, I hear all the time from coaches, like, it's my athletes. Like, I don't know what's going on with them. They just won't listen to me. And, sometimes I'm like, well, have you tried changing the way that you're, giving your messaging or whatever it is? And I think there's not enough of that self-reflection. I know there are great coaches out there that do it, but in terms of, some of the folks that I work with, especially youth coaches, my gosh, that's a whole, other, can of worms. But, being able to look at yourself and say, hey, could I benefit from any of this? And I would argue every single time that you can. I mean, somebody told me one time, a good coach has a coach, and being able to at least, look up to somebody and be mentored, whether that's from another throwing coach or a sport and performance psychology coach. If you're growing and getting better, I think that's the most important part. So I think it's a huge missed market.
So with things that are going on today, right? So the Olympics were canceled,
Yeah.
Or postponed rather, excuse me. How, like, what advice would you have for like that athlete who may have been on the cusp of like I work with throwers, so I had one athlete who, was on the cusp of making the Olympic trials in the hammer. And we talk, and he's like, coach, like, what do I do now? So my initial thought is, well, you're still young, right? So do it, because internally I'm like, well, you don't want to wake up when you're my age and like, oh man, like I only had 18 more months to train. So I've tried to put a spin on it of like, we have 18 more months. We can kind of start over again, at least physically, right? So we could start doing things that maybe we didn't feel comfortable doing before, because now we have a long time to like train and give ourselves an opportunity. But for the athletes who this might have been like the last one, right? Like have you, like, even with other mental performance coaches that are in your network, like how, like, is there like a common message like for those athletes, or is there like a common I guess like a common message that sports performance coaches want to be providing at this time? Or is it more like on an individual basis based on, age of the athlete or like circumstances? Or because the videos are really cool, like people have become very creative with how they're preparing for things. But to throw, you need a cage, you need a lot of space, and it's not, all the college, like I have high school kids that I worked with that are now in college, and like, okay, coach, let's go train. And I'm like, no, like you can't go anywhere on campus. Like they're closed
Right.
until May. Like we can't train. Like we have to like physically stay away, So is there like common messages or, things that are out there right now?
Yeah, I would say this is what I've been trying to kind of, put out there, and what a lot of
Yeah.
my colleagues have.
Mhm.
For those folks that are still, fortunately engaged in their sport and able
Right.
to continue to train in whatever capacity that is. I know it looks a lot different now, but looking at this as an opportunity. I think sometimes we, default almost to like this victim mentality, and I'm not downplaying the situation. It's extremely serious, and
Right.
it sucks. I mean, there's no way around it. But being able to say, okay, what's the opportunity here? How can this actually serve me? And looking at this as an additional, 18 months or whatever it is. I saw something on Twitter yesterday where, a coach said our fall season starts today. And so even looking towards, that something to look forward to and see it as preparation for the next season, even though we don't have a season now. So I thought that was super helpful. And then for those folks that unfortunately that, their season or career is over, that's a completely, different ball game. And I think one of the big things that, I've been trying to tell my athletes, and I see a lot of folks say, is like your feelings, first of all, are valid. A lot of athletes are processing this in the same way as we would a loss or, some other traumatic experience. And so being able to kind of sit with that and be okay with not feeling good right now, I think that's okay. And then really looking for, how can I, essentially they started their transition from sport. So how can I find a different piece of my identity, or something that I find meaningful, much like I did sport, to kind of start to grow in that way. And so that can be really helpful to say, yeah, Liz was a volleyball player, but Liz also really likes to teach, or, communicate with other folks and work with them and help them on their own growth journey. So maybe that's a little piece of my identity that I start to pull on. So those are the big things.
And with just kind of getting back, because you mentioned like you dabble in triathlon and things. So with something like that, where like, obviously you prepare for thousands of hours for 20 seconds of work, really, like in the circle. Where triathlon, like this is where I totally blew it the first go round. Like I was mentally totally not prepared of, coming out of the water and my heart rate is blown up, and I got to get on a bike and I got to try and go. And it was a sprint. So, it was a half-mile swim, 13-mile bike ride, and then a 5K. Like I was like I was totally, like it was over for
Yeah.
me. So, so, for athletes who are more of those like endurance type sports, is the message the same, or is it a little like, is it different in regards to, like I've read, like, you're on a bike for 100 miles, right? If you're doing a full Ironman, to embrace the pain. Like I've read like really feel it, like know where you are, where other people like myself are like, oh my God, like I've been 12 miles, I have 3 more to go, like I'm dying, like I just got to get through it. Like talk about like how that might be different for some of those more like, endurance sports. You see like Cameron Hayes, like does these crazy like 100-mile runs and like all these rucks and things. Is it different, or is it just like you're putting your mind in a different place, I guess?
Yeah, this is tricky. I think, from a fundamental standpoint, it's kind of the same, but I think of it a little bit differently. Endurance is a crazy thing. And, from my own, so I did a half Ironman. That's the distance that I trained for. And, I think, you spoke to it about making pain kind of your friend. I think with our shorter performances or more power, obviously there's a struggle, there's a different pain, but with endurance, man, that thing, it's a grind. And like you said, you can get in the water and your heart rate's pounding. And then if you're thinking about how, in a half a mile or even 1.2 miles, if you're doing a half Ironman, you have to get out and then get on a bike for like, so it's a different way to think about it. And I think for me, it's honestly like the biggest strategy that I use throughout that is just being able to chunk everything up and say one thing in front of the other. Like, I'm just going to make it to this next swim buoy. And then after that, I'm going to make it to the next swim buoy. And of course, being able to, monitor how you're doing, super important. And I think that's why, when you mentioned being able to tune in and pay attention to that pain and make friends with that pain can be a really helpful strategy, because it's not going to go away. You got a really long time on that bike, let me tell you. So making pain your friend is definitely, something that's a little bit different than, for some other sports.
Well, even like I've noticed like this, like I was going to register for a bunch of races, and everything up here in pretty much Western New York is canceled. Everything like through June and even into July, the race directors are like, let's just kind of hold off a little bit, which to me, it's like, wow, like in the mid-July, but like I would do like 1,000-yard like swim. And after like 50 yards, I like, there's a random thought of like, how are my kids? Or, oh my gosh, like I left my wife home with the kids again. Like she's going to kill me when I come home. Like how, so my distractions are, it's like 24/7, like for me personally. I don't want to turn this to like into a session with you and I, we could do that offline, but like for people who do have, who are juggling kids and like that work-life balance and like that daily grind, are there like strategies or tips that, I don't want to say easily be implemented, because in the past I've said that and people are like, no, it's not easy. Like you need to, retract. So things that people like 99% of the population that are, the recreational weekend warriors type stuff that can be implemented that might, not that are performing, like if I don't run a 10K, like I'm not going to get any better at it. So I know like just trying to focus on, like you said, like the chunking, mailbox by mailbox by mailbox. But for those of us who are just trying to get through the day to day that want to still be competitive in athletics, like is there like any place you can like, is there like are there materials, or is there just like a message that you have for us common folk in regards to that, like how we can improve our mental performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first biggest things is realizing that it is an important piece, whether you're parenting, whether you're cooking, exercising, there's a mental component to everything. And so the first thing that I always start with is this element of self-awareness. I teach, breath or mindfulness based techniques right up front. And I think, I'm going to try my best not to get on my soapbox, but I think mindfulness is one of the best ways to improve a lot of different areas of performance. And so that's something that I almost always recommend for whatever population I'm working with, is an element of stillness and being able to reflect and kind of see where you're at. I think once we have an awareness of where we are, then we can start to kind of create a path to improvement, if that's what you're looking for, or at least some sense of calm and relaxation. If you're a parent, I can only imagine. So, mindfulness or some type of breath awareness is one of the very first things that I always bring up, because I think that it gives us a sense of clarity in terms of what we can actually do to improve performance, and allows us to be a lot more present, whether, like I said, whether you're exercising or parenting. I think the thing we struggle with the most as a society is just being able to be completely engaged and aware and present in whatever we're doing. And so usually that's where I start is,
right.
Let's just take 5 minutes just to focus on your breath, build that self-awareness, and really start to hone that sense of presence. Because you can't do anything if you're not in the present moment.
Well, it's interesting because like we have a garage gym, so and at our house. So in the winter, you know, I always park outside, and every once in a while I'll post videos where I'm squatting or doing something where it takes a lot. Like you have to, you know, lots of concentration. And the kids will walk by, like they know, like if daddy's like in the cage, like we try and stop or not throw balls around, so I don't like, you know, kill myself.
Right.
And people are like, how do you do that? And to me, it's like, you know, I'm not high level. And like when I was a kid, 22, 23, like I thought I was a competitive power lifter. And I reflect back now and I'm like, man, like I wasted so much time. Like I thought I was good. Like I would come home from teaching and just like train and like totally, you know, not cognizant of like nutrition and rest and recovery. Cause you're 23. It's like,
right.
whatever. Like I'll go to bed at 2, go back, go to school, teach, and just do it over again. And now it's like, people are like, oh my gosh, like that's so cool. And I find it more rewarding. Not that I can squat 405 pounds, but when there's a toddler walking by and now all of a sudden, like, you know, I'm focusing up and now I'm like, okay, like, where's he going? Like sometimes I'll yell or say something and I lose my training or my focus and I got to re-rack. And it's interesting how you try and make it work with what you have. But yeah, I just look back and it's like, oh my gosh, like I wish somebody would have like pulled me aside and said, hey, listen, man, like you're training, but you're not really training. Like wait till there's actual distractions. And I find it so interesting talking to people like you and like other parents that are like high profile, that are competing at like Masters World Championships and Masters this and Masters that. And I'm like, wow, like you're in your like the 50 to 54 age group. Like I feel bad if I'm not training because like, you know, like you, like they are. And I'm like, wow, like there is something to it. And then, you know, reaching out, then it always comes back to, you know, you gotta, you know, it's either early in the morning before the kids get up or, my kids are in high school, so they're self-sufficient. So I have to like, you know, have to change diapers like I do still. But I feel more reassured that you share the you know, the mindfulness and some of that, because a lot of our schools in Western New York are hiring, I don't know, what's the right way of putting it? Somebody in the district that goes from classroom to classroom that teaches kids about mindfulness and teaches like breathing techniques. And it's really interesting because they come to the school where my son goes. And he's like, you know, Mrs. So-and-so comes in and they'll teach us to breathe and not, you know, get upset all the time. And he's able to apply it and he's 6.
Yeah.
So it's
awesome.
really, yeah, you know, and it's interesting. He's like, you know, Daddy, you know, don't get mad. He's like, you know, just breathe. And the exact same thing you said. So I don't know if it's like like, I'm not saying it's like a script, I'm just saying like tongue in cheek, like, wow, like he figured it out in his first grade classroom and he's got all these distractions going on. But no, it's really cool that we're kind of like on the right track as parents of
yeah. Hey, I mean, yeah, don't take parenting advice from me. I don't have any kiddos, but yeah, I would say that's spot on. That's really cool. You know, that's something that, you know, I've been picking up on a little bit. Obviously I do, you know, mindfulness performance in terms of, you know, military and sports performance, but it's starting to absolutely take off in schools. And I think maybe that's where some of the first interventions happened, even just to help with that emotional reactivity piece that your son's talking about. Yeah. So that's awesome that they're doing that.
Now, do you think that that's gonna, like when I was in high school, like the big thing was there weren't a lot of like athletic trainers in schools, or like schools were like sharing. And now every school almost, it seems like, has like a strength and conditioning coach, which was unheard of back then.
Right.
Do you think like the mental performance piece, do you think that's not too far behind in regards to like high schools? And I mean, you're in Pennsylvania, I'm in Western New York, so we're not that, you know, distance wise, we're not that far away. Do you think that's going to be like a trend in the next maybe like 3, 4, 5 years that school districts might start, you know, hiring mental performance coaches, or, you know, employing somebody that's also a teacher, I don't know, teaches like psychology class or whatever, like as an elective, that also works with student athletes?
I think so. I mean, I at least hope so.
Sure,
I think,
course. I hope so too.
Yeah. But I think so. I think we're starting to see it. Obviously things always start at the highest level where you have the most, resources, the most money. And I think we're starting to see it kind of take off in college athletics. Like we talked about at the beginning, a lot of it because of the mental health awareness. But I think, high schools eventually will follow suit. I know a handful of folks that, are already working at high schools in a similar capacity. Either they're a coach who also happen to have a master's in performance psych and do that work that way. Some teachers that do that. And then of course, some of the private high schools and academies have folks much like the strength and conditioning coaches that the bigger high schools have. So I think we're definitely, we're at the forefront, I think, of mental performance being integrated a little bit more. I think we might see it talked about a little bit differently at the high school level, more about like life skills development and things like that. But I think you're spot on. I think we're going to see it take off here in the next, hopefully, 5 to 10 years.
I mean, I see here, like the high school that I graduated from, we were one of the bigger high schools and in the state, like 600-700 student graduating classes. And that's where, my wife's an employee there and they have this mental, mindfulness person that comes and they work with the kids. And she also does work with the varsity athletes, and she's very active on social media. And I just find it really interesting, like that you're right. Like it's the haves and the have nots, right? Like the district that we live in, totally different. Like you graduating class is going to be like 200 kids. Like there's not as much, they're not as, prevalent when it comes to that. And then you see like IMG Academy in Florida.
Yeah.
Where they have like a whole department.
They have like 12 mental performance coaches. Yeah.
So for someone that, not to just take up too much more of your time, but so for somebody who wants to get into mental performance coaching or sports performance coaching, like what advice do you have for them in regards to like programs in the country? Because up here in Western New York, like, I think that the University of Buffalo kind of has something. It's not called mental performance coaching or sport performance coaching, but it's like an offshoot with kinesiology and like the nutrition department. Syracuse University, another big program. Like, I don't think that they like, is it something like now, obviously you can go to school for that, but before, like, I didn't even know that existed. My career might have taken a different path because I was interested in that at the time. But if somebody comes to you and says, Liz, I want to do this, what direction would you lead them to? Or like, what kind of resources are available for that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, Charles, you brought it up, earlier when we were talking about social media. I think one of the most important things you can do is look to somebody that is already doing this work and really link up with them and create that mentorship. That's something that I, tried really hard to do right at the beginning of my career, even if it wasn't, talking to them all the time. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Justin Sua and some of the other big names out there in terms of mental performance coaching. But linking up with the folks that are doing it at the highest level, a lot of them are willing to help and just be able to say, hey, here's how I kind of got my start. I think another big thing, like we talked about earlier, is just being able to know, like, there are programs out there, but also try not to get so, focused on just sport and performance psychology. There's so much, so many other disciplines that go into being a successful performance coach. And I think another big thing, aside from the education, is just being able to be familiar with how things work from like a departmental or operational standpoint. That's helped me tremendously in terms of when I go in to talk to an athletic director, if I already know what types of demands or, budgetary constraints or, what types of things they're facing at that department, being able to know how they operate has been extremely helpful. And so just knowing, again, I guess it's the business side behind, sports. There's so much that goes into it to be able to be, a coach that makes an impact. You have to know the context that you're operating in and not being afraid to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I don't know everything. Let me just take a minute to really dig in and find out what I'm really working with here.
Because I've noticed there's a lot of universities that are offering online. One comes to mind just because a couple of athletes that went to the same college as me in Fredonia, Adams State, I know it has it's starting to boom, like online sports performance, where if you can't get to Colorado and like here in Western New York, there's really there aren't a lot of avenues. And then we kind of talked offline a little bit with the University of Missouri with Rick McGuire and Amber Selkin and their program. So there are opportunities for people out there who might not physically be able to go to class. But right now, no one's physically going to class anyway, so it doesn't,
right,
it
yeah.
doesn't matter. But so Liz, if somebody wanted to reach out to you and they're interested in some of the mental performance coaching that you offer, how can they do that?
Yeah, sure. So I have a website, deltamentality.com. I spend most of my time though on Instagram and Twitter. Not quite gotten into the TikTok or Snapchat thing. So, but my Instagram's at delta.mentality. And then on Twitter, I'm at EA Brookhouse.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Liz, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you, taking an hour out of your day there in central Pennsylvania to come on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Charles. This has been great.
Absolutely. Hopefully we could do this again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it. That sounds great.
Take care.
All right. Take care.